Regulation is currently a topic of massive political interest, since as a result of the financial panic, governments now want to extend and deepen regulation in innumerable ways, as Professor Balcerovas pointed out today. The attitude is now almost universal among politicians, and it glosses over or even ignores completely certain inconvenient facts. Notably that the banking industry is one of the most highly regulated industries in the world and was 2 years ago. What happened in finance was a failure of something wider than regulation and something that remains to be fixed. It was, in two respects, a failure of the agency principle. Now, the agency principle has been a matter of concern and difficulty ever since James Burnham wrote The Managerial Revolution in the 1930s. How can we ensure that an agent acts in the interests of his ward or his shareholders or his clients? We can have criminal laws to prevent the worst fiduciary abuses, but these will not catch sophisticated managers because they know more than the police about how their companies or businesses or professions work. So we design various incentives to ensure that the interest of the agent and the client are as identical as possible. In recent years, these incentives have included various ways of linking the manager's income with the value of the stock. As we know, however, managers then manipulated the value of the stock temporarily to increase their income. It was dishonest, of course, but we were not relying on honesty when we designed it. We were relying on intelligence, and intelligence worked to frustrate it. In the banking scandal, the agency principle failed in two vital respects. I keep insisting on this too. The bankers plainly acted in their own interest and not for their clients. And in the case, apparently, of Goldman Sachs, they actually appeared to bet against the stocks that they were recommending to their clients. The second way in which the principle failed was that the regulators failed in the most blatant and extraordinary way to control and prevent quite obvious fraud. Now, here I'm going to quote the testimony of one very shrewd investor, Warren Buffett, to the US Congress. And is this the passage that's up? Yes. This is Mr. Buffett testifying to Congress. I presume that it will be read by the translators, but I will just read it as well. He says, something called OFHEO was set up in 1992 by Congress, and its sole job was to watch over Fannie and Freddie, someone to watch over them. And they were there to evaluate the soundness and the accounting and all of that. 2 companies were all they had to regulate. OFHEO had over 200 employees. They have a budget that's $65 million a year. All they have to do is to look at 2 companies. I mean, you know, I look at more than 2 companies. And there they sat, made reports to the Congress. You can get them on the internet every year. And in fact, they reported to Sarbanes-Oxley every year. And they went, wrote 100-page reports, and they said, we've looked at these people, and their standards are fine, and their directors are fine, and everything was fine. And then all of a sudden, you had 2 of the greatest accounting misstatements in history. You had all kinds of management malfeasance, and it all came out. And of course, the classic thing was that after it all came out, OFHEO wrote a 350, 340-page report examining what went wrong, and they blamed the management, they blamed the directors, they blamed the audit committees. They didn't have a word in there about themselves, and they're the ones that 200 people were going to work every day with just 2 companies to think about. It shows the problems of regulation. Well, it shows more than the problems of regulation. The regulators in that case may not have been corrupt, but they were certainly idle. They were certainly thoughtless. They certainly betrayed their clients, in this case, the United States taxpayer. And they helped to cause, or at least not to prevent, one of the greatest financial problems of the last 40 or 50 years. Now, there's a paradox here. The financial regulation that is supposed to be the remedy for the abuse of finance, including the failure of fiduciary duty and of the agency principle, the financial regulation is itself an example of the failure of fiduciary principle and of fiduciary duty and the agency principle. Market failure here is matched by government or regulatory failure. Now, I know that such failures are not universal. And I know that some failure is not an argument for doing away with regulation altogether. I'm not an extreme libertarian. And we have to develop new regulatory controls against new abuses as they reveal themselves. But the likelihood is we and by we here I mean the government, the public sector, people from outside, we will always be playing the game of catch-up, always lagging behind the innovations of free market capital and, in this case, finance. So we need to consider a wider and more general solution to the problems thrown up by the agency principle in the private and the public sectors. And what that is, I will return to in a moment. Now, let me turn to my second example, and that is the target and bonus culture, something which you get across bureaucracies in the public and private sectors, but which is more common, for reasons you will see, in the government sector. As the conservative political theorist, an Australian, Kenneth Minogue, has pointed out, our economy, and especially our public sector, is struggling in a morass of targets which replace professional judgment with administrative rules. This stems from two causes. One is the expansion of government, and the second is the decline of professional regulation. But of course, the expansion of government fosters the decline of professional self-regulation. As government expands, it increasingly employs middle-class professionals, doctors, lawyers, and so on. Any failures in the systems in which they work then create a demand, a political demand, for some systems to be changed to correct the failures, and therefore to manage the work of professionals who were previously self-regulating. Increasingly, the professionals are not trusted to reach the right decisions. Instead, the administrators design regulations, targets, and incentives, bonuses, to direct the professionals into the right politically desired channels. Here is Minogue's description of how this culture actually works today in Europe. To be a doctor is in some degree less these days to exercise professional discretion than to be bound to follow guidelines issued by the government of the day concerning every subject of interest, ranging from the drugs that may be prescribed to the times when services must be available to the public. GPs, general practitioners, who used to be entirely self-regulating, that is to say outside the limits of the law, are currently regulated in terms of something called the Quality and Outcomes Framework. The hours to be worked by doctors in hospitals are regulated by the European Union in Brussels. That's Minogue. I think it would be hard to improve on what he said as an example of making a system so perfect that no one needs to be good. But the actual moral impact of this attack on professionalism is to discourage the virtues traditionally embedded in the professional ethic. Professional ethics are really always the application of common or garden standard ethical rules to specific occupational problems. Journalistic ethics, for example, really comes down to being about the pursuit of truth. I mean, there are a lot of complications, but essentially journalistic ethics tells you to find out the facts as best you can and to tell the truth about them as best you can. Everything else is a kind of frill. Equally, doctors, for example, must have an obligation as doctors to provide the best treatment for their patients, not necessarily the least costly. Professionals live within a culture of duties and obligations which reflect morality. Duties and obligations, both self-enforced and enforced by professional bodies when they fall by the wayside. Increasingly, however, in today's world, they move within a structure of rules and controls imposed by governments and official bodies. Their responsibility to their clients or their patients is replaced by their legal duties to their government or employer. And as they lose control of their work, they themselves are tempted to exploit the bureaucratic rules in order to benefit themselves financially. The longer this process continues, the more administrative rules diverge from professional ethics, the more professionalism declines, and the less confidently we can rely on the professional advice we are given.